So we will be going over both the historical and current immigration policies and events that have happened that have affected Asian immigration in the US, as well as some like high-level overview of what immigrant communities in the States look like. So, and I'd just like to point out some upcoming events. This is part of a series, so we'll be going over a few different immigration topics over the next couple of months. Our next one is next Sunday at the same time. That will be going over the pathways to immigration. So the routes folks have taken to get to the US and some high-level information about visas, green cards, refugee status, and more. And that will be with Rashmi Shah and Allison Chan, sorry. And we've also got a storytelling session coming up at the end of the month. So that is called Heritage. The theme is Heritage, and that'll be space for you to share your story and listen to other folks. And this will be in collaboration with El Pueblo. So there will be some Latin community members there as well. We'll all be talking about kind of how we got here and life in the States. And one more interactive event that you can join is in a couple weeks. I don't even know what day it is now. I guess May 5th is probably in 2 weeks from now. This will be a chance to speak to your representatives to advocate for better data collection, especially in light of the recent rise in anti-Asian incidents. And this is both virtual and in person, so you can choose either option. You can sign up for that at ncaatogether.org/NCTogether. So up next, I'd like to introduce Rick Su, who's going to be our first speaker today. Later on, we'll have a presentation from Hoang as well. And they'll both be going over, again, Immigration 101, some high-level stuff. And Rick is going to be going over the more historical context, kind of how we got to where we are today. Rick, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction. And it really is an honor to be here to talk about the history of Asian Americans in the United States, and especially how it's intertwined with the development of US immigration law. Now, what's interesting about this, I think, is how this particular history is actually relatively unknown, even to members of the Asian American community. And I feel it's especially important to know this today, given the challenges that the Asian American community faces. Certainly, that includes the violence that is occurring in the last several years, but also just these stereotypes that persist, right? Whether it's the perpetual foreigner myth that continues to sort of plague our particular community, but also the model minority myth, right? That is oftentimes used to classify the Asian American community. And of course, this is all related as well to the relationship of the Asian American community with other and racial and ethnic groups, especially with regard to controversial issues like affirmative action. So what I want to suggest here is that this history that I'm going to go through shows that the experiences that the community is facing today is not new, that it's rooted in the experience of previous generations of Asian Americans to the United States, that it's also tied to legal developments. In fact, Asian immigration to the United States is one of the primary drivers of immigration legal development in the United States. And more specifically, how those immigration laws then affected how we understand the Asian American community today. Now, what's interesting about the history is that it actually goes back quite far to the 19th century, which actually makes the perpetual foreigner myth especially striking. So Asian immigration to the United States actually began in 1815 with Chinese immigration come to the United States, and culminated in a wave in the 1850s. Now, most of these immigrants were laborers. They were associated with the gold rush, construction of railroads, menial services, including servants, agriculture, laundromats. Now, what's interesting about this history and the time of it is that even though we tend to think about Asian immigrants as relatively new or recent, this history shows that actually the first Asian immigrant wave coincided with the first wave of European immigration. Of Irish and Germans, and actually far before many other European groups came to the United States, including those from Southern and Eastern Europe. And in fact, this earlier wave was quite significant. By 1880, about 8.7% of the population in California was Chinese. That's more than the 4% that's there now, and comparable to the 14% of all Asian Americans in California today. So, if the wave of Asian immigrants in the United States was so early and so significant, then why is it so often overlooked? Well, part of the reason is geography. When we think about Asian immigration, when we talk about immigration in general, we tend to look to immigrants that arrived on the East. But most Asian immigrants in the early days arrived on the West. So instead of looking at Ellis Island, we're actually talking about Angel Island. And I can say this, the experience at Angel Island was very different from the experience at Ellis Island. Another reason deals with essentially the myth of the American heritage. It's striking because, in some ways, many of the stereotypes that were applied to Asian Americans in the 19th century not only echo the sentiments applied to immigrants today, but also sort of contributed to this idea that those early Asian immigrants, in some ways, didn't contribute or build up to what we understand to be America. Now, so what were some of these stereotypes? Well, there were stereotypes that essentially Asian immigrants were taking jobs, that they worked harder than other races, and that whites cannot compete with essentially Asian workers. There were connections of Asian immigrants to slavery, right? The sort of term coolie was applied to many Chinese immigrants, sort of suggesting that in some ways their labor weren't free, that they were recruited to come to the United States and were working under a system of oppression, or that they themselves didn't understand exactly what free labor meant. There were connections of Chinese immigrants to criminality, especially opium, which was sort of the drug of the day, or at least the sort of moral crisis. And this also then flowed into a sense of moral panic, right? Which again, we see applied to immigrants today. Most of the Asian women that immigrated in the 19th century were considered to be prostitutes. Most of the men were considered to be moral degenerates. In fact, connected to the opium connection, trend, there was a strange phenomenon actually in the late 19th century, this idea of white slavery. And what it actually referred to was this idea that somehow Chinese men were luring white women into opium dens and essentially turning them into slaves of some sort in this sort of sense. Other stereotypes, there were connection of Chinese immigrants to disease. There were concerns about the replacement, essentially, theory that contributed to what we know as yellow peril, that the growth of the Chinese population meant that it would entirely replace all the white sort of residents in the West. And then there was this sort of the striking idea that Chinese immigrants and Asians in general were somehow racially incapable of becoming democratic citizens, that they just didn't have it within them to understand exactly the nature of what it means to be within a democratic system. Now, all of this, of course, then led to a substantial wave of discrimination against Asian immigrants, especially at the state and local level initially. Concerns about jobs led to essentially zoning regulations that targeted certain immigrant industries, especially laundromats. There were prohibitions of Asians being engaged in certain types of employment, including fishing, and then later on we'll talk about some restrictions on agriculture. Concerns about disease and assimilation led to actually one of the earliest forced segregations that we had in the United States, quarantines, if you will, of Chinese immigrants. In fact, Chinatown in San Francisco was defined by essentially these zoning boundaries that forced all Chinese to live within certain blocks. And of course, there were violence. Race riots were actually quite common. This is something that is not known. Many Western communities actually expelled through violence most of the Asian immigrants within their communities. Several Chinatowns were burned to the ground, oftentimes more than once. And in fact, there were a lot of deaths that occurred out of this as well. There was a race riot in Chinatown in San Francisco in the 1870s. In which or at least it was alleged that one Chinese immigrant had killed a white person. As a result of that, 17 Chinese individuals were lynched during that riot. And concerns about economic competition led 28 Chinese immigrants to be killed in a mine in Wyoming. Now, besides state and local regulations, this also then translated into federal regulations, and more specifically with regard to immigration. Now, one thing to note here is that actually federal immigration laws did not exist for about 100 years after the founding of our country. This is to say, not to say that we didn't have any immigration regulations. Most of those were at the state and local level. But the federal government didn't get involved in regulating immigration until the late 19th century, right? And not surprisingly, it began with the Chinese. The Page Law, which was one of the earliest immigration laws to be passed by the federal government, it was passed in 1875, and it targeted Chinese immigrants more specifically. But you can see in what it's targeting some of the stereotypes that we talked about earlier, right? So it prohibited the recruitment of unfree labor, and though the law didn't mention Chinese, it was imagined that it would be primarily applied to Chinese coolies. It was prohibiting the importation of women for immoral purposes, again connected to this idea that most Chinese women that were immigrating to the United States were essentially prostitutes. And this was generally applied for the most part to the Chinese, even though Chinese were not mentioned specifically in the act. Now, the racial targeting became a lot more explicit once we got to 1897, and that was the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, probably the first comprehensive federal regulation of immigration itself, and targeting specifically Chinese coming into the United States. One thing that's noteworthy about this, as I said a little bit earlier, unlike the Page Law, there was a specific racial exclusion, right? It applied specifically to the Chinese, and not just immigrants from China, but essentially Chinese that would be arriving from anywhere. Now, what's striking about the racial exclusion itself is that at the time that this Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, this was already post the Civil War. In other words, we've already enacted the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause. And in fact, the Supreme Court has already upheld the Equal Protection Law clause to protect Chinese immigrants on the basis of race. They did that in 1886. But interestingly enough, when it came to assessing the constitutionality of this immigration law, the Supreme Court actually said that race was explicitly okay when it came to immigration. So the sort of racialized history of immigration started essentially with a law that targeted the Chinese. And more importantly, this particular law not only had a racial targeting in it, but it was also against a treaty that the United States had signed with China at the time, the Burlingame Treaty. Now, what's interesting about how the Supreme Court dealt with this treaty is it essentially said that the court has no say in whether or not Congress wanted to essentially reject or renege on an existing treaty. And that essentially immigrants themselves can also not appeal on the basis of that treaty. That if they had to appeal, they can only appeal to the country from which they are from and have that country then negotiate with the United States. And this kind of sort of perpetuates the myth that we have, the stereotype of of Asian immigrants as perpetual foreigners, that they can't appeal to the country in which they are in. Instead, they should be appealing to the country from which they are from. Interestingly enough, the passage of this law also then triggered one of the earliest sort of concerns about what we may now refer to as undocumented immigration. People like to say that the undocumented immigrant problem is relatively new, but actually it was not. And again, most of this was applied to Asian immigrants at the end of the 19th century. The Chinese Exclusion Act had a exception to it, which is to say that it applied to immigrants from China that were coming after the passage of the law, but not to immigrants that were already here when the law was passed. But what ended up happening was that there were a lot of concerns that people were fraudulently creating documents suggesting that they were already in the country prior to the passage of the laws, or that many people that were here had snuck in and therefore were not actually in compliance with the law because they came after the law was enacted. As a result, Congress then passed a separate law that required every Chinese immigrant to go through a hearing process in which they had to provide proof that they were here in this country prior to the passage of the law. And interestingly enough, in that law itself, the proof that is required at least one white witness. So if you cannot get one white witness to vouch for your presence prior to that law, you could not be then certified and could be removed and deported as being unauthorized in that particular context. Again, there was a racial component to the white witness, but the Supreme Court thought that that was perfectly legitimate. And in fact, I made statements about how it's understandable that Congress would be concerned about whether or not Chinese immigrants would tell the truth in court, given their sort of sense about sort of the oath, or whether they were racially incapable of doing so when supporting someone else in the community. There was also concerns about so-called paper children. That may be sort of the earliest sort of statement with regard to the sense of unauthorized immigrants. It occurred because there was a fire in San Francisco in 1906. It burned all of the birth records that were in San Francisco at the time. As a result, individuals who were born in the United States and therefore citizens automatically cannot use that birth certificate to prove that they were in fact US citizens. And as a result, the general understanding of the time was that all Chinese immigrants, if they were claiming to be born in the United States, were lying, that they were paper children in that particular regard. Now, what was interesting about the original Chinese Exclusion Act is that initially it was temporary, but it kept getting renewed every time it expired. And by 1920, it was made permanent. And it was applied entirely to the not only to the Chinese, but to all of Asia, what they refer to as the Asiatic Barred Zone. Now, what's interesting about this development of federal immigration law targeting Asian immigrants isn't just that our initial immigration law targeted Asian immigrants, but also that this particular federal targeting then had a connection to later state level discrimination that essentially on the federal law. Now, what's interesting here, right, is that not only did the federal government restrict immigrants from China, but the federal government actually had a long-standing law that prohibited anyone that wasn't white from naturalizing. Now, naturalization law was later then extended to blacks after the Civil War, but the racial restrictions still remained with regard to Asian immigrants. They were essentially considered ineligible for naturalization. Now, what this actually then allowed was for states to pass laws that weren't targeting race specifically, because that would be against the Equal Protection Clause, but actually targeting individuals that were ineligible for naturalization. Now, it just so happened that ineligible for naturalization meant Asian in this particular time period, but however, it escaped essentially constitutional scrutiny because they can argue we're not targeting a race, we're targeting a status as defined by federal law. So what did states do? Well, California barred anyone ineligible for naturalization from owning land. There were a lot of agricultural conflicts in California at the time. There was arguments that there were too many Chinese and then later Japanese farmers, and that they were sort of taking over the agriculture industry. So as a result, the state passed a law that banned essentially anyone ineligible for naturalization from owning any land, and that was upheld by the Supreme Court. California also barred anyone ineligible for naturalization from getting a fishing license. And again, it was competition with regard to fisheries that led to this particular bar, and that was also upheld by the Supreme Court. Interesting enough, at the time, talking about intersectionality, if you will, the immigration status and the racial status then also sort of mixed with gender stereotypes and gender subordination in some ways. So at this particular time, it was generally understood that when women married, that they became essentially legally mixed with their husband. Well, then the federal government decided that if a female citizen were to marry someone ineligible for citizenship, um, that they would actually lose their citizenship. So that if, for example, a woman who happens to be a citizen marries a Chinese immigrant, they would lose the citizenship themselves as long as they were married. Again, based on this ineligible for citizenship component. This also led, interestingly enough, at the time with the naturalization law to some really interesting Supreme Court cases, really probing the idea of race. And in some ways, I'm proud of Asian Americans for raising this, and I'm also appalled in some ways by how the court addressed it. But I'm glad that they were sort of calling their mix. So if you recall what I said earlier, the naturalization law said that only whites can naturalize. So then there was this legal suit that was filed by Ozawa, a Japanese immigrant, who went to court to say that he should be able to naturalize because he was white. And how did he make this claim? He said, I am really, really pale. In fact, my skin color is whiter than most European immigrants. So by the federal law, I am white. I am about as white as it can get. And the Supreme Court took that and said, okay, okay, we know what we mean by white. We don't mean color of your skin. What we mean is a racial category. We mean Caucasian. You're not Caucasian, so therefore you're not white. All right. So Caucasian is what the Supreme Court says the federal government meant by white. So then what happened? Well, then there was another individual, an Indian immigrant named Thind, and essentially from northern India. And he filed suit. He said, okay, well, you said in the previous case that white means Caucasian. Well, guess this. So I've been looking through the sort of anthropology of essentially the Caucasian race. And what they're saying is that the Caucasian race came from the Caucasus region, right? And sort of, uh, and it happens that by that race heritage, Northern Indians also came from the Caucasus region. And therefore, I am also Caucasian, right? If you're using Caucasian. And the Supreme Court took that and said, okay, fine. We didn't really mean Caucasians in that sort of sense that you're talking about. What we mean is you're just not white. We know it when we see it, and you're not white. So it was sort of interesting, right? These two Asian immigrants that were really challenging in some ways what it means to be white, but also showing how artificial in some ways of these sort of racial classification in the United States. So with that said, what happens after that? Well, we had the two great world wars, and especially World War II. And of course, on the one hand, World War II brought about probably one of the most tragic, I would say, incidents in US history, which was the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. And this, of course, didn't apply just to Japanese immigrants, but also to citizens that were born in the United States of Japanese heritage. On the other hand, however, World War II also then sort of started to erode some of the Asian exclusion provisions in federal immigration law. And the reason for this was that we had Asian allies when we were fighting World War II. So it was hard to sort of appeal to China as an ally, while at the same time having laws on the books that excluded Chinese immigration and also Chinese naturalization. So as a result of post-war, there were some initial relaxations of those particular racial exclusion. Once we got to 1965, however, there was a radical restructuring of our immigration system. And most of what you're going to hear about our immigration system really has its roots in the 1965 passage of the Immigration and Naturalization Act. Now, part of the sort of story behind the restructuring in 1965 was that it was part of the civil rights era. So, right, so we're going away from these sort of racist policies. But it's important to note that the particular categories, even those that we are fighting about today or raising controversies today, actually were also used as proxies for race, even though they didn't have race specifically in them. So what are these? Well, the 1965 Act and the immigration system today privileges family reunification. Now, there's a lot of controversy about family reunification right now because they say it brings together too many Latin American immigrants, too many Asian immigrants. But actually, the original idea for family reunification was that this meant that most immigrants would again be white. Remember, most of the individuals in the country at that time were white. They assumed that the people that would apply for family reunification would also be applying for European immigration, more specifically Irish immigration at the time. And in fact, that's the reason why the employment-based immigration category was smaller than the family-based category. And it was assumed that most non-whites wouldn't fit under the employment-based category, either because they couldn't get a job or wouldn't have the educational sort of qualifications in order to qualify for that particular component. Now, what ended up happening after that was completely unanticipated. It was unanticipated that there were going to be a lot of Asian and immigrants from other areas that were able to come under the education and work criteria. And then once they came under the education and work criteria and became citizens, would then use family reunification to bring over other family members from Asian countries. On the other hand, however, that was also around the time that the Congress came in and put in the per country caps. Again, not specifically racial, But because every single country is capped at approximately 20,000 individuals per year, it has a tremendous effect on larger countries, especially countries from Asia. So India, China are chronically backlogged because of the 20,000 per country cap. Now, the interesting thing about the 1965 Act as well is that it creates, in some ways, two unique features of the Asian American community today. And what I'm talking about here is the bifurcation of the Asian American community economically, but also the model minority myth. Now, the bifurcation means that because of the immigration categories that we have, that most Asian immigrants that are coming legally through the employment-based category tend to be extremely educated and extremely high skilled, right? On the other hand, the individuals that are coming from the unauthorized or coming undocumented tend to be extremely low skilled, which explains why the Asian American community has not only severe, overrepresentation on PhDs, but also overrepresentation in terms of levels of poverty, right, on the one hand. Second, it actually connects up to the stereotypes that go under the model minority myth, right? I mean, certainly, the arts, humanities, poetry were just as important in Asia as it is in the United States. But because the employment-based category meant that an individual had to get a job and had to have specific skills that were recognized, Asian poets and Asian artists, like my father, weren't easily able to come under the employment-based category. So what did you get? You got recruitment along the lines of science and math, right? In that particular regard. So you had individuals that were coming because of the categories that were defined that then create the stereotype of Asians in general, especially within the United States. So just as the earlier generation of Asian immigrants were both shaped and also shaped immigration policy because of these stereotypes, in some ways, the modern stereotypes themselves are also a product of the immigration laws as we have them today. So I want to end in some ways with some lessons that we might want to be able to take away from this history. So one of the lessons is just general, right? Which is the importance of this history itself. I think it's important for the Asian American community to claim and stake their claim as Americans, not just because of what they're doing right now, but because of this long history of other generations of Asian immigrants that came to this country before us and their experiences and their work and the challenges that they faced. And in some ways, I think this experience is important for us not only to understand ourselves as a community, but also to understand the effects of immigration law and policy, right? Not only in terms of how it may affect whether we can bring over family members or have the opportunity for other individuals to come to the United States, but also in some ways the community within the United States itself and how immigration laws shape that. The second lesson I think is important too is to make a distinction between politics and law. So what do I mean by this? So one thing that was really interesting with the first wave of Chinese immigrants is that they coincided with the immigration of the Irish. Now, both the Chinese and the Irish faced discrimination when they were in the United States, but their trajectories went in opposite directions. So even though the Irish faced discrimination, they were eligible to naturalize. And as a result, because they were eligible to naturalize, local political machines and later state political machines recruited Irish immigrants in order to get their votes. So Irish became over time an incredible important voting bloc in essentially democratic politics in the United States. The Chinese and the Asian immigrants were ineligible for naturalization. They never got recruited. This didn't mean they didn't fight back. What's striking about our early Asian ancestors was that they were probably the one ethnic group that was the most successful in litigation. They brought several cases. They won many of those. They were hiring the best lawyers. They were winning a lot of cases. But winning cases at the end of the day didn't really matter. Without any political power, without political mobilization, ultimately they were still excluded by federal law, and there was nothing they could do with anything about that, even with the lawyers that they had at that particular time. So as much as we want to think that law is important, and certainly understanding the law and pursuing litigation is important, we have to also understand that the history of immigration shows that being politically mobilized is equally, if not more important, in order to assimilate and find a stake a claim in American society. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rick. Oh, Hoang, you unmuted?
Okay, and thank you so much, Professor Su. I really giving us a historical perspectives and lessons that we can take on from here. I really learned a lot. For my part, I'll talk about the current immigration scheme, and as I share with Fan that if you have any question during the presentation, please feel free to ask, and I will address it at that point. So there are three topics that I'll talk about. One is the categories of immigrants in the United States, some recent developments, immigration developments under the current administration, and then the contributions that immigrants have made to this country during the pandemic, and to give a snapshot of a really extensive body of research on how immigrants give much benefit to this country. And any view that I expressed today is my own. So one group of immigrants, as Professor Su mentioned, they try to become naturalized US citizens. And by that, they currently, to do that, they have to be a green card holder. And there's two main ways they can do it. One is they apply to become a US citizen after 3 or 5 years having the green card. The second way is if that person is a permanent resident and derives US citizenship through a US citizen parent. There are many benefits of being a US citizen. Of course, the right to vote, and as Professor Su mentioned, to get involved in politics and make policies that way. They can also travel outside the US and can remain outside the US for however long they like, and they could still return to this country. They cannot be deported from the United States unless there has been some issue at the beginning with their getting the green card. So in 2019, there 61% of the 14.1 million immigrants from Asia are naturalized US citizens. And you can tell that there's a striking number, and it's a big block. And as many of you might have probably heard, how the Asian American voters in Georgia help the Democratic presidential candidate and the senatorial candidates win the 2020 election. The other categories I'm going to talk about next are all non-citizens. And the first category are for those who can live in the US indefinitely and can work without restriction. And this category include groups like permanent residents, green card holders, and refugees and asylees. A permanent resident can become a US citizen after a number of years, but the term permanent resident is a misnomer because it doesn't mean that that person can stay in the US permanently. That person can lose that status by leaving the US for a long time or having been absent from the US through several long trips. That person can also lose that status by having some criminal conduct or conviction in his or her record. Another statistics is that in 2019, the over 1 million new permanent residents, over a third is from Asia. Refugees and asylees, like permanent residents, can stay here indefinitely and work. They are people who suffered past persecution in their countries because of some enumerated grounds, or they are afraid of going back to their countries because of one of those grounds, one or more of those grounds. They can apply to become permanent resident and then eventually US citizen. The next category is non-immigrants. And these people are those who are allowed to come into the US for a specified period of time for some specified purpose. For example, an international student is here to study, and he or she is allowed to work outside off campus only in his or her field. And after graduation, he or she is allowed to work for anywhere from 1 to 3 years. And then that person has to figure out how to change to another status or find any other way to legally stay and remain in the US. And then there are other groups in this category, including visitors, temporary workers. You heard about H-1B. If you look at statistics here, so almost 90% of H-1Bs granted in 2019 were for those from Asia. And we have U status for victims of crimes, of certain crimes in the US, T for victims of human trafficking. Both U and T allow those who hold those statuses to apply for the green card 3 years after getting those statuses. And then another group is temporary protected status. And that is for people whose countries are facing civil unrest, environmental disaster. And then the last group that I want to cover is the undocumented. There are about 1.6 million Asian immigrants are undocumented in the US, and about 10% of them have DACA. And DACA allows those young people who are here to be protected from deportation. They may get employment authorization to work and also travel permit. So under the current administration, there have been some important immigration changes. One is that the current administration ended the travel bans against immigrants and temporary workers. The previous administration, citing the pandemic, prohibited relatives of US citizens and green card holders from immigrating to the US, and also banned H-1B and other workers. The current administration also did away with the public charge rule, the more stringent one that the previous administration pursued. And the previous administration pursued a public charge policy that required prospective immigrants to provide a lot of proofs that they would not be a liability on the US government and would not rely on this government for support. So that with the ending of that public charge policy, that makes it easier for immigrant applicants to get the green card status. The current administration also vows to preserve and strengthen DACA. It also indicates that it would not pursue enforcement and deportation of those who have minor crimes. And instead, it would focus on those with serious crimes and of national security concerns. The current administration also designates Burma as a country whose nationals can apply for temporary protected status. So TPS would allow Burmese, say, to work in the US, to live here and have legal status, and also to travel. The current administration would also increase the admission of refugee, the refugee quota. The previous administration allowed the lowest number of refugees to be admitted into this country. It was only, was it 12,000 or 10,000? I cannot remember. The current administration indicated that it might increase it up to 62,500 by the end of this fiscal year. During the campaign, the presidential candidate indicated that he would like to increase that all the way to 125,000. Sorry, my bad. And given the extensive body of research indicating how much immigrants give a net benefit to this economy and also to this country, I instead want to focus on what we are going through now and show how much immigrants have helped this country during the pandemic. So one of my heroes is this professor and researcher, Catelynn Carrico. She spent most of her professional career researching mRNA, and that is the basis for the Moderna and Pfizer BioNTech vaccines that many of us have had. She is from Hungary, and she experienced many challenges, including failure in getting funding for her research, demotion, but she persisted, and thanks to her, many of us get protection from the virus now. Both Moderna and Pfizer are founded by immigrants, and our Zoom session today also is possible thanks to the founder of Zoom, who is a Chinese American. And then I also want to talk about many other immigrants who work as essential workers during this pandemic, nearly 20 million of them. And out of those, there are 6 million who are frontline essential workers who have to be in person at work and do all these amazing things to keep our country running. And 69% of undocumented immigrants are frontline essential workers, and they deserve much thanks and hopefully some kind of immigration changes that would take into account how much they have helped this country. And then the Asian Americans Together provides this slide so you can read more about some statistics that have been used in my slides. And with that, I'm open to any question you might have.
Thank you so much, Hoang, and thank you so much, Professor Su, as well, for sharing all of that information. That was really incredible. And I'd love to take a moment to kind of go over a few questions as well, and pause and see if there's anything that either of you want to add or comment on that came up in either, like, across your presentations.
So I do really like Professor Su's point about how you really have to combine the law and politics to affect real changes. I mean, we lawyers cannot litigate cases alone with all the mobilization that NCAAT and other organizations have done to get people to apply to become US citizens and to vote.
Yeah, I want to echo that as well. And I think in some ways, it's important, I think, in sort of the political mobilization to bring up a lot what Hoang brought up, which is to sort of show how much immigrants in general, but also the Asian American community has already been contributing to essentially not only the American economy, but American society. I think there are some shifts in that direction, right? Especially as there's more visibility for Asian Americans, especially in the arts and other areas where people are just getting exposure to that. But I think both of those are very important components. And I think for a long time, even as the Asian American community has grown, contributions just has not been highlighted in that particular regard.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I thought that was a really interesting point as well, and something that I've been thinking through. I think one piece of that is the mobilization piece and folks coming together across these different groups to mobilize for immigration policy. And I guess one question that I have is, oftentimes when you see it in the media nowadays, especially with what's going on at the South US border, when we think of immigrants, when we think of DACA, we don't often picture Asian people. And so what are the implications of that? And what are some ways you think we could be moving forward together in solidarity around DACA? And I guess this is a two-pronged question. How does that impact Asian communities right now? Because again, we don't often see that impact.
Yeah, so I think in some ways, like because of the salience of the border, the Asian American community hasn't really been tied in or involved in the unauthorized immigration population or problem. But the truth is, it is, right? As Hoang mentioned, right, there is a significant number of Asian Americans that are unauthorized, undocumented in that particular case. Now, one thing it suggests in some ways is that American policy is focused on the wrong side, right? So we're so focused on border crossers, especially in the southern border, when actually the biggest contributor today to unauthorized immigration is actually visa overstays, right? Is individuals that arrive in the country with some sort of visa, it could even be a tourist visa, and then lapse status, right? So it's actually through our airports and that sort of dynamic that's actually contributing to the growth of unauthorized immigration. And that actually goes a little bit under the radar in partly to racialize the undocumented immigration problem. But this is also to show that in some ways the Asian American community hasn't really been focused on the immigration problem, especially when it comes to DACA and unauthorized immigrants. I think partly it's because of the bifurcation of the Asian American community, right? I think in some ways, because it's so bifurcated on sort of the upper level, especially the upper economic strata, that we ourselves as a community haven't really built like the other communities I think has been building that kind of sort of cross-class economic mobilization, right? So our restaurant workers, right, are sort of, they're not tied into the Asian American community as a whole, especially, the researchers and the PhD holders, right? So that I think contributes to some of those particular problems. So unless we change that perspective and to see this as like affecting the community as a whole, and also identifying ourselves as a community, I think it becomes, it's too easy to sort of shuffle it off into discrete categories. Oh, that deals with those immigrants, or that's not really an issue with the Asian American community, when it actually is in those cases, right? It's too easy to put up those blinders.
Yeah, I totally agree that in terms of undocumented immigrants, there is a sizable number who are here as undocumented because they overstayed their visas, and there's a sizable Canadian population who is undocumented in the U.S. That we don't hear about very often. And I agree how to just get all those Asian immigrants with different skill level and different experiences to collaborate. And I'm really interested in hearing too, anyone would like to share how we can reach out to other immigrant groups and how we can work together to affect lasting immigration changes that can benefit all.
Thank you. And kind of building on that question as well, on the main, like my initial question, how has that bifurcation that you were talking about, Professor Su, how might that have impacted some of the undocumented folks who maybe are not include, when people are saying like, oh, that's not an Asian issue, has that impacted some of the undocumented folks? And Hoang, I'm wondering, since you work with students as well, like, have you seen any impact there on like Asian undocumented folks? And this is a question for both of you, by the way.
Yeah, I think it plays a large and significant role, because I think, look, undocumented immigrants by themselves already are pushed into the shadows. That, in fact, is one of the biggest concerns. It's not just the deportation concern. It's the fact that when you live in the shadows, you feel or you are in actuality not protected by other areas of the law, right? So if you become targets for, let's say, wage theft or robbery or something like that, you may be afraid to report it, right, in that particular regard. And the interesting thing, actually, in New York City, one of the major targets of robberies is undocumented Chinese immigrants, right? Especially on Fridays when they get cash, because of the general understanding is that they have a lot of cash and they're not going to report it. Now, I think this actually becomes a bigger problem for the Asian American community, because I feel like the Asian American undocumented is even more in the shadows because they don't have that broader network or community that vocalizes those concerns, right? In some ways, right? So like there are, Asian American groups that are sort of focused, Asian American business groups, right, that have been very active. They don't see themselves as sort of connected to undocumented immigrants. And as a result, I feel like, unlike undocumented immigrants and other ethnic and racial groups, there's even less visibility, pushing them further into the shadows and making them even more sort of prime targets, right? Because it's not that you just can't go to the police. That's number one. You don't even have a community to go to, right, to sort of, I'm hoping some of that changes because of the recent violence. Now Asian American groups are really sort of active and sort of publicizing, collecting data, like we need to pay our attention to these sort of vulnerable individuals within our community. I'm hoping some of that extends to the undocumented population in the Asian American community as well.
Yeah, I work at NC State, and I have to say that there have not been many undocumented Asian immigrants coming to my office, and I don't know because there is a low number or just because they don't feel comfortable coming forward.
Yeah, and I think that that is something that we see kind of across the board with a lot of Asian data in general, is like so many of us are not reporting things, so many of us are not it's just kind of like flying under the radar. And I think especially here in North Carolina, what I've been seeing has been because we're not somewhere that's like Orange County, California, where everyone is together, it's kind of like everyone is scattered. It's hard to find each other. It's hard to find this larger community for that support. Coming back to another point as well, we were talking again about that politicization of some of these topics, and I thought it was really interesting in the history portion of this, hearing about that kind of back and forth of like, oh no, that's not what we meant. Actually, this is what we meant, and it's very like, it seems very arbitrary. And I'm wondering, how has that affected us today? And do you still see that happening in law today?
Yeah, so I think, even more clearly today, especially with the research, I think we're sort of, seeing how, on the one hand, race is always been and continues to be really significant in the United States, but the categories themselves are really hard to define, constantly moving and very fluid and unstable, right? Unstable in some ways. I mean, one instability to sort of focus on is how, I talked about the Chinese and the Irish, right? Like, the Irish, Southern Italians, they were considered a different racial group at the turn of the 20th century, right? The story actually there is how they became white, right? It was funny because in the early 20th century, the racial categories actually divided between the whites. There was sort of the Nordic, the Teutonic, and then the Mediterranean, right? In the Mediterranean, the Southern sort of European immigrants, right? Darker, swarthier skin, I mean, that's what they called them, were considered racially different, but they became white, right? They somehow assimilated into whiteness, right? And that was sort of the story of the 20th century. So I think on the other hand, that instability is always there. And I think it's going on today, especially as we have all these different groups from all these different areas, and then mixed groups, right? We're getting a lot more mixed race, right? How is that going to be categorized going forward, right? In some ways. And we've, in some ways, dealt with it really poorly for African Americans in this country, right? On the other hand, I want to say the complexity of race for the Asian American community is actually the complexity of nationality. I think the problem with the Asian American community is defining ourselves as a community, right? I think in some ways, especially for, certainly our parents' generation, they don't see themselves as part of a sort of pan-Asian community. Now, one thing to know is that this was the same for most European groups, right? When Europeans came from, Europe, they were themselves fiercely divided between their nationalities and also within their particular country. Italians and Southern Italians were heavily divided. But it was in the United States that they built that sort of broader community that we're all Irish, we're all Italian, we're all German, even though they were sort of heavily divided. So the question is whether or not going forward, that's going to happen in the Asian American community, right? Or whether or not we're still going to be sort of like, well, are Asian Americans different? Are Chinese Americans different? The Japanese Americans, the Indian Americans, Vietnamese Americans, sort of going down those lines, right? I had to say, the sort of recent adjustment to the census, right, which is now listing all of those groups, like, on the one hand, good for data collection, but listing all the nationalities sort of playing into the sort of, the sense that there's just significant divisions within the Asian American community as a whole and how we build that. And then the last point I'll just end it was triangulation, right? I mean, all the affirmative action debates and everything, like we are in a weird position still within a nation that's sort of focused on the black-white divide, which is really important and heavily enduring. But where we fit into that, right, I think is going to become a major issue going forward. And that's, again, the fluidity not only of racial categories, but the sort of racial structure of power within those categories.
Do you have anything you'd like to add, Hoang?
No, I think it is, yeah, Professor Su is very well said.
Thank you. Yeah, and I guess, and something that's been coming up for me as well as you talk about that, like categorization, especially like you said, as we're as historically we've entered into this context of like black-white stratification, and we're kind of in this weird place in the middle and like kind of being pitted against everybody, right, with the model minority myth. And now you're talking about these legal implications. And I've definitely been thinking as well, like we're talking about, addressing anti-Blackness in the Asian community, that, and I hear that, and I think we're saying Asian versus other people, but there's still, I think within these different ethnicities, there's still not really agreement that we're all Asian. It's kind of that like, and so when you're talking about how certain folks from different European countries became white, I'm kind of like, where are we in this process of becoming Asian? Because, and it's really strange to be tackling some of these topics as a whole together as Asian when you kind of think about it, it's like a made up Western term. And so thinking through this legally, like today, is there still like are there still legal implications here, or is it has it become more of a social thing?
Yeah, I think there are still some legal implications that would come up, and maybe political implications. So let's go with sort of, I think, what we might be going on right now, what we're heading into, and then maybe a little bit of history, right? So I think what we're going to do right now in some ways is whether or not, if Asian Americans are going to become heard, or they're going to be seen, or they're going to be a substantial block of some sort, whether in politics, in some ways they have to be some degree of unification, right? And let's not forget the Latino, sort of population, the Latinx population, they are also fiercely divided with all sorts of internal stereotypes between different nationalities, right? But I think in some ways they are starting, which is, they have their some internal divisions as well, sort of coalescing, at least being seen as a Latinx group that essentially politicians appeal to. So that, I think, is going to be always significant today. I think going forward, it's going to be interesting, right? Because I think that going forward, there's going to be, I don't want to be too dark, but I think there's going to be some potential for foreign affairs tensions with certain Asian countries, and whether or not, during Japanese internment, right? Were there other Asians that were speaking out on behalf of Japanese or not, right? Even though there were Japanese Americans, right? So if we go into a future in which, let's say, a new Cold War erupts between the United States and China, are the Chinese Americans going to get excluded, or are they going to be embraced? Certainly there are experiences, right, where for certain groups to sort of get better positioning, they exclude another segment of their group. Or at least I'm not Chinese. Or, when I was growing up, anti-Japanese bias was huge. And I think it was really sort of convenient, right? This is always the whole thing of like, depending on your ethnicity, you get called a certain stereotypical name, right? And a slur, and you're like, oh no, you're talking about the other racial ethnic group, not mine. But is that what we do? Like we say, oh no, you're actually referring to Koreans, right? That's not me. But that's like a weird response, right? The last is the history, which is to show that the broader racial fights does have implications always for Asian Americans, even if they're not named. I know I'm just like throwing out cases. There's this really interesting and famous California Supreme Court decision. Essentially, what it said was there was a California law that said that blacks, so blacks, Native Americans, and some other category cannot testify in court, right? Like their testimony would not be respected. And the question was whether or not it applied to Asians, right? Because it doesn't say Asians, right, in that particular lawsuit. The state was arguing to apply to Asians as well. And you had this really interesting argument, right? The court was like, well, the state says Native American, well, they said Indians, right? They said Native Americans. And we know Native Americans historically came from Asia, or at least that's what we think. So we think when the state said Native Americans, they were also saying Asians. Or if that argument doesn't work, it says we exclude blacks, and by blacks we essentially mean anyone who isn't white, and therefore if you're non-white, then therefore blacks is also Asians, right? So you had this weird opinion that was like Asians are Native Americans, Asians are blacks. But you see in that sort of racial kind of, right, it's not always a solution to say, well, I am not black or I am not Native American, you can discriminate against them. Because as these opinions show, it's just as easy to say, oh, well, the state is also referring to you because you are not white, right? So in some ways, I think it's always relevant, regardless of the racial fight, because it always has an implication for us as a community, but for all racial groups in the United States.
And I think that, like Professor Su pointed out, that the arbitrariness of the many cases that discriminated against Asians is all over in our history. And again, the fighting that many Asian Americans continue to do it, I mean, would force the court to have to address it and give us rationale. And hopefully we're living in a time where there might be more enlightened courts than the ones in previous years.
Yeah, and Hoang, some of the stuff that you mentioned, like ending travel bans and that kind of stuff, some of that sounds like pretty positive. And kind of coming back to some of the recent developments that you mentioned, are there any ties that you can see from like the history, the way that it's been set up to today? Are there still some things that you mentioned that are, like you just mentioned, that bias, that arbitrariness is still happening, but are there any direct ties between some of these policies today that you mentioned and like kind of historical context there? Could you kind of tell us like how is that all connected to today?
Yeah, I do see that the travel bans were pretextual and using the pandemic as a way to keep immigrants out. And the public charge, again, is really raises a lot of questions about its discriminatory effect, because it affects mainly family immigration, and that family immigration is a big part of immigrants coming from Asia.
And another question, this is like a much more straightforward question. You mentioned like refugees and asylees. What is there a difference there, or are those terms used interchangeably?
So refugees are those who apply for protection when they are still outside the US, they are abroad. And asylees or asylum applicants are those who are here in the US already, and they asking for that kind of protection from harm in their home countries. So those are the main differences. There are also different benefits for refugees and asylees when they have gotten those statuses. Refugees, they are required to apply for the green card 1 year after they have arrived in the US. Asylees don't have to. Refugees can wait until they have gotten all at least 4 years to apply for the green card, and they still get that kind of 4 years of credit being a refugee in counting toward US citizenship or naturalization requirement. Asylee, they can only count the number of years that they have gotten the green card when they apply for US citizenship. They cannot count the years that they have been an asylee toward that residency requirement. So those are some of the differences for refugees and asylees.
I see. Okay. So definitely not interchangeable. Thank you so much for highlighting that. These are some of the details that I think I haven't known about just from like reading headlines. Again, that was kind of my really only background of learning about immigration is really the headlines. And the headlines are so often dominated and like pushed back and forth between certain narratives. Oh, and I'm seeing the time now, so sorry, I guess we're a little bit over. So I'll just ask, I guess, one more question. I don't want that to be my last question. It's not very happy. I guess we could just wrap it up. Well, okay. What are some misconceptions about Asian immigration, either historically or currently, that you think are still commonly held that you would like people to leave here today, knowing the real circumstances of? And I guess just some takeaways that you'd like people to leave with.
Yeah, I'll sort of start. I think in some ways the biggest takeaway I want to sort of present is that that Asian immigrants has a long history of coming to the United States. That in some ways we are also at the backbone of building America, right? I mean, even physically, right? The railroads were built, right? I mean, you know, even though they weren't there for the picture, well, they were excluded from the picture, right? The meeting of the two ends. So I think, and I think that's important, right? Because it shows in some ways that we have a long legacy, we have a long lineage, we have a long history of both mistreatment, but also our own contributions. And even if we can't necessarily trace, let's say for myself, my ancestry to that particular wave, I think just as other immigrants do in America, I think it's important to say, like, they are also our predecessors. They are part of our ancestors. They are part of that particular generation. You know, certainly for other sort of ethnic groups, that's how they see it, right? That group as a whole. So I think that's the most important part. And I think that is a misconception, right? Because I think the general sense among the United States is Asian immigrants is a relatively new phenomenon, right? And I think going forward with the trends, which is that Asian immigration is going to be the largest growth sort of driver of immigration. And I anticipate, just given the history, we are going, you know, Asian immigration is going to face a massive backlash, which we're really beginning to see, even against the sort of high skilled, right? We thought the high skill would protect the Asian, but that didn't, right? We only saw that sort of turnaround with restrictions on sort of employment-based immigrants, even in the tech sector, right? That the race is always going to be a component. So going forward, I think it's important to sort of then take the position. This is not new. This is a long lineage, this is a long history, and we have as much of a claim to being Americans and having that American legacy as any other ethnic group does in the United States, any other European ethnic group.
I do really like that point that, I mean, looking at the history of immigration, Asian immigrants have been here for a long time and have contributed mightily to this country. And that's, I think that's the point that I'd like to keep people, to have them keep in mind, is that, you know, we do contribute significantly to this country, and there's a net benefit for this country for having immigrants. It's an asset. Immigrants pay taxes, they fulfill many jobs from high skill to low skill. They help even native born to be able to function in the jobs they do, because we feel many areas that native born here need to have their people employed. So I think that is another point that people should keep in mind when they address the immigration debate.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and what my initial question was, and y'all answered it already, was like the misconception of and how to address this. The idea is like there's no space for immigrants. Like we just had it open at the beginning because there was already so much space and now there's not, and immigrants don't pay taxes and blah, blah, blah. Like, so I think y'all answered that already in a much more positive way than me asking that question directly. And yeah, I really appreciate y'all giving us the time and sharing this. I've learned a lot today, and I'm sure a lot of other folks have too. Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.